So this chapter begins to look at the rise of new nations as a result of decolonization. And one of the things that Gaddis does is basically place the importance of those events in the context of the Vietnam War. So the discussion question for this week is asking you to do two things. The first one is to evaluate the way in which allies are created in a world where new nations do not have to claim alliance. So, those places that were colonized primarily in the continents of Asia and Africa will become crucial to the way in which the Cold War will develop after the 1950s. So one of the things that I am asking you to do is to think about who you evaluate as critical allies in the context of the Vietnam War. The chapter actually repeatedly uses the word allies to talk about how alliances are created and then disbanded depending on the individual interests that are expressed. And so I want you to pay attention to that and give me your evaluation of who might be important to which side. And in this particular case, of course, it's going to be the United States or the Soviet Union, and why they are important. Why are they critical? Why is it important that the United States, for example, have allies in North America? And why is it important that the Soviet Union keep places in what we consider Eastern Europe, but that are very much to its immediate west, happy during this period? The second part of the question asks you to consider the decisions that American leaders made during the Vietnam War. As a matter of fact, there are specific sections in the chapter that talk about things that were said by presidents at the time and how they impacted the types of protest movements that would develop in American society protesting the war. So, last week we talked a lot about the importance of information and the way that information was disseminated. What we are going to see in the context of the Vietnam War is that there is a lot about American skepticism in regards to what leaders are actually telling the American public about the war. And so pay attention to that in the chapter as you read. So one of the things that I am going to talk about here is the way in which the war in Vietnam actually develops. So one of the interesting features that you can find in Gaddis' text is that he goes back and forth. And as a matter of fact, he talks about how the seeds for independence from colonial empires really begins around World War I as a vestige of Woodrow Wilson's idea of self-determination, but that it's not really going to be until World War II that these nations are going to engage in independence. And so the Vietnam War is going to come at a time where many of these nations have not only begun to protest colonial rule, but in fact will become successful. Vietnam is a very interesting case, of course, because Vietnam had been part of the colonial structure of the French Empire, and the problems that will arise in Vietnam actually begin before the U.S. entry into the war. And one of the things that I wanted to do by showing you this particular outline is that the United States entrance into the Vietnam War is actually going to be gradual. So, for example, when a decision was made with many countries in attendance in regards of creating a North and South Vietnam, that actually takes place in 1954, and the United States is actually there at those talks. And then, of course, we know that civil unrest continued through the end of that decade and, of course, well into the 1960s. So the United States had been concerned about what was taking place during that period. And they will engage in direct entry into the war really in 1964. And of course, that is discussed here. The second thing that will happen is as the United States takes a more active part in the Vietnam War, what we will see is that the American public will actually begin to turn on the participation of the military in the war. So you have these massive protests that will begin to emerge during this period. So, of course, then what we can say is that, in fact, the actions that are being taken by leaders in Vietnam are then going to affect the way in which Americans react to the war. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the fact that at the time, service becomes compulsory for young men, and many young men will be drafted to participate in the Vietnam War. So those are the stakes, right? Both in terms of what's happening in the world and what is taking place in the United States. So I wanted to call your attention to one of the first pages in chapter 4. So this particular quote is from chapter 20. It's the very last paragraph, and I'm going to read it and then explain it. It says, Khrushchev's fate reflected in microcosm that of the Soviet Union and the United States during the 1950s and 1960s and the early 1970s. The international system during those years appeared to be one of bipolarity, in which, like iron filings attracted by magnets, all power gravitated to Moscow and Washington. In fact, though the superpowers were finding it increasingly difficult to manage the smaller powers, whether allies or neutrals in the Cold War, while at the same time they were losing the authority they had once taken for granted at home. And of course, this is the main thrust of this chapter, and both questions are related to this point right here. The weak were discovering opportunities to confront the strong. The nature of power was changing because the fear of power, as traditionally conceived, was diminishing. Mallets were indeed beginning to turn into flamingos and balls into hedgehogs. So this is really the main idea that Gaddis is exposing in his chapter. So if you missed that piece as an explanation as to why he decides to structure the arguments in the chapter in the way that he did, you may want to go back and take a look. And to help you out with that, what I wanted to do was give some context that Gaddis actually does not discuss. So the first one is, after World War II, there is a very rapid dissolution in colonial power across Africa and Asia. And this particular map, of course, actually shows you the regions that were held by certain European powers, the years in which they were, in fact, eventually to become independent. And of course, this gives us a better sense of why they are important in the context of the Cold War. You'll notice that all of these are taking place mostly in the 1950s and the 1960s, but of course, some of them begin to happen as early as the 1940s, for example, in the context of Myanmar and Burma. This decolonization will then be seen as a threat from both Russia and the United States, because now you have these new nations that are seen as potential places where they can exert their influence, and depending on which side you're on, that could be a problem. On the other hand, this is going to be seen as an opportunity for these nations to use the events of the Cold War, and more importantly, the animosity between the United States and Russia, to actually place their interest front and center. And this, of course, is connected to the idea of non-alignment, a concept that is introduced on page 124 in your chapter. And this idea of non-alignment, of course, basically means that now that these powers have gotten rid of European influence, they can basically leverage their potential alliance by pitting the United States and the Soviet Union in trying to maintain their power. And so for example, the first example that Gaddis provides actually is Tito in Yugoslavia, where he basically takes advantage of Russia to a certain extent, certainly by Gaddis' estimation, to use them to advance his own interests and the interest of keeping himself in power. And this is going to happen over and over again. There are several examples that are discussed. Gaddis obviously is going to address issues that are connected to the importance of China throughout. You also should pay attention to the way that he talks about allies, and he will address them directly. And of course, this also has to do with non-governmental organizations such as NATO, because of course, those organizations will also provide opportunities for alliances as well. In terms of the United States also had several concerns about its own imperial ambitions. So we have to go a little bit further back to 1898 and the Spanish-American War, where the United States actually acquires four important territories, and they're going to be important, especially in regards to the military. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that next in the next couple of weeks. But basically, after the Spanish-American War, you have the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba as the main places where the United States will exert its influence. And I wanted to explain this cartoon. So this cartoon is actually from Puck magazine, which was really popular at the turn of the 20th century. And one of the things that we see here is that the caption at the bottom basically states school begins, but the full caption says Uncle Sam to his new class in civilization. And this is supposed to be Uncle Sam saying, now, children, you've got to learn these lessons, whether you want to or not. But just take a look at the class ahead of you and remember that in a little while, you will feel as glad to be here as they are. And so the class ahead of them, of course, you'll notice here that there is a Native American depicted in the back. You'll also notice that there is a Chinese child depicted here. On the board, it says, the consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very, very rare in fact. And then it continues, England has governed her colonies, whether they consented or not, by not waiting for their consent. She has greatly advanced the world's civilization. The U.S. must govern its new territories with or without their consent until they can govern themselves. And so obviously these are very pointed critiques of imperialism, both outside of the United States as well as within the United States. I want to call your attention to this poster at the very top of the image. And this particular poster is supposed to read, the Confederate States refused to consent to be governed, but the Union was preserved without their consent. You'll notice that there's also an African-American child on the top left of this particular cartoon. So, you know, the United States was also dealing with questions of imperialism, both within its territory as well as through newly acquired territories at the end of World War II. And as a matter of fact, we know that Puerto Rico and Cuba are going to be important in the context of the Cold War. And we will continue to address that as we continue with our class.